Okay. Well, first of all, just let me say thank you all for being here. This is an opportunity following on a book group that we started, and we have a mission of doing public education to get people aware of what mass incarceration is and how it affects the left and what we should be doing about it. In my experience, the progressive left has been fairly blind to the problem of mass incarceration over the past decade or so, and it's coming around now that mass incarceration and the problem with the criminal justice system are becoming progressive issues, and so I am glad to be here to push that agenda forward. And so let me just jump right into it then. Let me first give you a roadmap of what I'm going to talk about. First of all, I'm going to talk about what mass incarceration is and how big it is. Second, I'm going to talk about what the origins of mass incarceration in the United States are. The third part is going to be on the political economy underlying mass incarceration. And then lastly, I'll discuss some of the things that I think we should be doing about it, what our mission as a progressive left should be. So let's jump right in. What is mass incarceration? The first thing to know is that the United States has 5% of the world's population, and we have 25% of the world's prisoners. That's huge. We have more prisoners per capita than any other country in the world, including China. For example, Japan has 63 prisoners per 100,000. We have 753 prisoners for every 100,000 people in the population. Germany is at 90 per 100,000. Poland comes closest to us at 224 per 100,000. So we have 3 times as many prisoners per capita as Poland does, which has the second highest in the world. Now, the mass incarceration is fairly new, too. In 1970, we had about 200,000 people incarcerated in our prisons. That started to grow in 1970 with the Nixon administration. So there was a 5-fold increase by 1992 when we had 1 million people in prison. And then again, it grew to 1.57 million by 2012. So we now have 1.6 million people behind bars on any given day. Now, if we think about it as what percentage of people in the country are incarcerated, we have about 1% of the total population of 18-plus-year-old people in prison on a given day. So of the 18-year-olds and older, we have 1%, 1 per 100 people in prison. And if we look at the 20 to 24-year-olds, the young people in our country, we have almost 2% of those people in prison on a given day. Now, if we look at the African American community, it's substantially worse. Of all people in prison, of all African Americans 18 years of age and older, we have about 3.5% of those folks in prison on a given day. And in the 20 to 24-year age group, almost 6% in prison. That's about 1 in 16. Now, if we think about it in a slightly different way and try to think about how many years of life lost to imprisonment are there, and look at it across groups, we see that about 0.05, what I'm looking at is by age 45, how many years have the average person spent in prison? And on average, white women will spend 1/20th of a year in prison by age 45. So on average, it's about 18 days for all white women by age 45. On average, black men will spend 3 years in prison by age 45. That is, the average African American man has spent 3 years in prison by the time he turns 45. That doesn't mean everyone does or everyone spends time in prison, but that's an average that gives you some idea of the magnitude of the problem. Now, if we look at the ratio of life lost to imprisonment, the years of life lost among among Latino women compared to white women is 1.8 times higher, and African American women compared to white women is 4.6 times higher than white women. But among men, the years of life lost to imprisonment by age 45 is 2.1 times higher for Hispanic men and 6.2 times higher for African American men. So African American men are spending 6.2 times as much time in prison by age 45 as are white men. Now, thinking about it in a third way, if we talk about how many people are we talking about that actually go to prison, that is, how many people have ever been in prison, the risk of incarceration has been going up over time. Among African Americans, cumulative incarceration has risen from about 5% of all men going to prison at least once in 1979 to almost 28% in 2009. That means more than 1 in 4 African American men has spent some time in prison in 2009. Now this is especially true for persons with no college education, and the largest increases are among those persons with low education, where in 2009, 67% of African American men without a high school degree have spent some time in prison. I find that just astonishing. 67% of African American men without a high school degree have spent some time in prison in 2009. That's 2 in 3. That means in this room, we would have several people, if we were all African American men without a high school degree, we would have several people in this room that had spent some time in prison. In short, to quote Bruce Western, incarceration is a pervasive event in the lives of poor and minority men. Punishment has become normalized, affecting large social groups rather than just the behaviorally distinctive persons that live in the shadows of social life. Now, finally, talking about the magnitude of mass incarceration, we also need to understand how geographically concentrated it is. I have some beautiful slides here that I wish I could show you that show where the persons that are in prison have come from, the neighborhoods they lived in when they were incarcerated. And as we all know, I suspect, we know that they come from specific neighborhoods, and in Chicago, the west side, the south side, the near west side and the south side, and in New York, the Bronx and parts of Brooklyn, and so on. In Detroit, the southeast side near Brewer Park, and it's so highly concentrated in some areas that there's a 2-block area in New York City where 31 men are currently incarcerated that came from that area. It's costing $4.4 million to keep those 31 people in prison from Brownsville, New York. $4.4 million to keep 31 men in prison from the 2-block area.
What time frame?
These are very recent figures from the last couple of years.
4.2 million, is that it for 1 year?
That's what it's going to cost to keep these men in prison for their lives, for the time that they're going to be in prison. Now, to sum up, mass incarceration is relatively new, it's peculiarly American, and it targets a relatively small slice of the population, especially those that are minorities, men, lower income, and inner cities. Now, a quick note on what mass incarceration does to our children. The probability of having a father in prison by age 14 is 50% of youth born to an African American father with less than a high school education will experience their father's imprisonment by their 14th birthday. Half of children of African American men with less than a high school degree are going to see their father go to prison by the time they're age 14. And these odds are 13 times higher for black youth than they are for white youth. And between 1978 and 1990, the gap between black and white youth has doubled in that 12-year period. So it's gone from an odds of 6.6 to an odds of 13.1. So as the phenomenon of mass incarceration has taken hold in this country, it is increasingly affecting the African American community, and especially the undereducated African American community. If we look at the probability of a mother's imprisonment in the same time periods, 1 in 20 African American youth with mothers of less than high school education will experience a mother's imprisonment by age 14. That's substantially lower than men, but these odds are almost 6 times greater for African Americans as for white youth. And it's quoting Stephen Wilderman, parental imprisonment has emerged as a novel and distinctively American childhood risk that is concentrated among black children and children of low education parents. So we are damaging our children as much as we are damaging our adults with our mass incarceration. Now, if we turn this around and think about it in a slightly different way, by age 23, 32% of our youth will have been arrested at least once for something more serious than a minor traffic infraction. That's 1 in 3 of our youth will have been arrested at least once by the time they're age 23.
Black and white?
That's all kids. That's all kids. And you can imagine it's far more concentrated among minorities, but I don't have those numbers in front of me. Now, the community impact of mass incarceration is pretty damaging as well. I'll talk really quickly about 3 issues: what it does to human capital, what it does to social capital, and what it does to the collective efficacy of the community and the local informal social controls that make a community strong and cohesive. The human capital effect. Folks that have been arrested have gaps in their job experience, and as we talked about before, that usually happens in the critical ages between 20 and 35, when you're getting the critical experience for your what will determine your job prospects in the future. Incarceration leads to lost earnings for both yourself and for your family, and lost education. And let's not kid ourselves, there is no education and no preparation going on in our prisons, getting people ready for reintegration into the community. Now I'm going to quote Rebecca Pettit. Increasingly, black unemployment, including that resulting from incarceration, combined with declining earnings among workers, has halved the relative economic position of young black men. In 1980, young black men earned almost 58% of white men's hourly wages. In 2008, blacks earned on average 30 cents on every white earned dollar. Now, these are numbers that you won't get out of the standard survey figures that the government releases, because they don't capture what happens to the incarcerated and to other folks that are falling off the grid for one reason or another. 30%, and those are resources that are not going back into the community and are not helping build strong families. Now, if you consider these figures in light of the concentration of poverty, the picture is even more bleak for specific neighborhoods. So those lost wages and lost earnings are concentrated geographically, as are the rates of imprisonment. So the impact on communities is really harsh. It depletes resources tremendously, and is bad for people and their families. Now, the social capital impact of mass incarceration. Having large numbers of persons being forcibly relocated tears at the fabric of the family and the community. The ethnographic evidence that we have suggests that family members of incarcerated persons withdraw from community activities and institutions, and that incarceration often leads to family financial difficulty, and it leads to family mobility with families moving in with other family members, and it often leads to children winding up in foster care with the Departments of Children and Family Services. community efficacy. Forced migration, which is what you can call mass incarceration, damages the ability of communities to regulate themselves. We know that informal social controls are the best mechanisms to reduce crime and disorder in a community. It's not the police, it's the local informal social controls of strong bonds between neighbors that reduces crime. And the mass incarceration and moving 1 in 6 men in and out of a community destroys that ability. Now, I will tell you who said this in a moment, but this is a quote. "In far too many places, a vicious cycle of poverty, criminality, and incarceration traps individuals, devastates families, and weakens communities." Now, as I said, the progressive community is starting to realize that mass incarceration and police and our policing patterns are a progressive issue and are very important to the progressive agenda. And that's working its way up into the liberal community as well. That was Eric Holder recently coming to the realization that his Justice Department is doing damage to communities as well as arresting people. And it's a very good sign to see this filtering upwards that way. So now, for the second part, let's turn to the origins of mass incarceration and the forces that underlie the dramatic growth we've seen in mass incarceration in the United States over the past 40 years. What I'm going to do is walk through the 40 years a couple of times. First, I'm going to walk through it and talk about the partisan political dynamics that contributed to mass incarceration. Then I'm going to back up and walk through the legislative outcomes of those partisan dynamics, and then we will turn to political economic issues in the third part of this talk. The reason the political dynamics are important is because the specific shape that mass incarceration has taken is in part a consequence of the partisan political dynamics. It's not predetermined, but the exact shape is resulting from exactly how the two parties have played off of each other on this thing. Now, in 1964, Barry Goldwater was the first person to use the crime issue in a national political campaign. That's not to say that's the first time crime has been a national political issue. Herbert Hoover, of course, J. Edgar Hoover, of course, and Eliot Ness and Prohibition were all national issues, but these were not used in the partisan debates of the time. The partisan debate really started with Barry Goldwater. Now, Lyndon Johnson, who ran against Goldwater, was starting to see fairly early on that crime and criminality were an important challenge to his war on poverty. He was starting to see that there was a coalition of Southern conservatives and Western conservative Republicans that were coming together to oppose the civil rights movement and the counterculture. So while he was passing the last pieces of the Great Society legislation, he sees the writing on the wall, and other things are happening as well. We'll get to the legislation in a few minutes. Now, Johnson didn't run in '68, but Nixon tapped into the anti-civil rights backlash and the countercultural backlash and tied the counterculture, organized crime, and urban violence all together in his campaign message to get the especially white urban more conservative voters to come over to him. And as H.R. Haldeman said, and this was caught on the Watergate tapes, Nixon emphasized that you have to face the fact that the whole problem to be posed to the public is really the blacks. The key is to devise a mechanism that recognizes this while not appearing to do so. So what he's saying is we want to play the race card, but we don't want to say race. And I think this is where the subtitle to Michelle Alexander's book, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness, comes from, and that's part of it. I stole part of that title to title my talk. Now you can't, so since Nixon, you can't use the N-word, you can't say race, but you can talk about law and order and take back our streets, and it's an implicit reference to the race card. Ronald Reagan used crime as a central issue in his campaign, and he pulled the Reagan Democrats, the so-called Reagan Democrats, Southern whites, Northern urban ethnic groups, into his coalition, and won the presidency in 1980. Now he's transforming the war on crime into the war on drugs specifically. So as we look at the legislation in a minute, we'll see that Ronald Reagan is inheriting the war on crime issues. He's inheriting the race baiting issue tactics, and he's turning it more and more to a war on drugs as much as a war on crime. And then George H.W. Bush, the first Bush, he body slammed George Dukakis with the Willie Horton ads. And while Bush talked tough on drugs, and he racializes the image of the drug problem with his campaign ads, he actually provided fairly little money for the war on drugs. And then the United States population became entranced in the first Gulf War, and little else happened during the Bush administration. But then our dear friend Bill Clinton came into office. He fought back against the Republicans with the crime issue and really took it on wholesale and brought the crime issue into the liberal side of the Democratic Party. He gets really tough on crime. During his campaign, he actually went back to Arkansas to oversee an execution. This was an execution of a man who had killed somebody and shot himself, was mentally disabled. But he went back during his campaign to be sure everybody knew how tough on crime he could be. He courted the Reagan Democrats back into the Democratic camp, and the result was some of the harshest crime legislation in the history of the United States. Now in 2000, with Bush versus Gore, during the entire 2000 electoral campaign, there's a turnaround. There are only 102 statements in the campaign about crime, and only 15 of these were about drugs. This seems odd, but in a sense, the project was finished. Both parties had come to the same position that the war on drugs was a major issue and was a driving issue behind American public policy. So it's no longer a partisan issue, it's an agreed upon issue, and since then, it has not been contested in the presidential elections. Now, okay. And just quickly, during all of this time with these contests, scholars have tracked what the media was doing, and what we have found is that the media is not reacting to public concerns and public anxieties about crimes the way you would think the policy process would work if you were in Political Science 101. The number of New York Times articles actually follows the political agenda of the administration in office, so it lags slightly behind and follows the lead of the opinion makers. And if you track that against the polls where people are answering the questions about, are you anxious about crime, what are your biggest concerns, you find that they don't correspond. The number of New York Times articles is what drives people's concerns about crime. So to sum up, the specific forms mass incarceration has taken in America have been driven by a series of political decisions, and one of the main dynamics of which is the contest over the white ethnic swing voters. It's kind of like a rugby match where the Democrats and the Republicans are one team and the African American community is the football. So let's back up and go through that same time period and talk about the legislative outcomes at each point along the way. Now, as I said, Lyndon Johnson was very concerned about the crime issue, and he saw it as a potential challenge to his civil rights agenda. But early on, in 1965, he passed the Law Enforcement Assistance Act. In 1967, the Safe Streets Bill was passed, and in 1968, the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act was passed. Now, again, the political impetus behind these bills was a coalition of Southern Democrats and Western Republicans. This legislation created the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, which was the first major federal involvement in local street crimes. It was a massive investment in the material and the intellectual technologies of criminal justice. It established a role for the federal government at the local level for the first time in American history, and it pushed lots of money down into local policing and local law enforcement. When Richard Nixon came into office, one of his big concerns was organized crime, and he passed the Organized Crime Control Act of 1970 and then the Comprehensive Drug Abuse and Control Act of 1970. Again, the impetus behind his passing of these laws was to link together in the voters' minds the urban riots, the mafia, and the revolutionary organizations of the civil rights movement into an undifferentiated enemy. Another thing that came out of these was the Rico Statutes, so that asset forfeiture was for the first time one of the weapons that law enforcement had to fight crime. Ronald Reagan came into office with three major pieces of legislation: the Comprehensive Crime Control Act of 1984, the Sentencing Reform Act of 1984, and the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986. Now, since this is about mass incarceration, these bills increased the maximum sentences for a variety of federal crimes. They imposed mandatory minimums, notably for possession of small amounts of crack cocaine. They broadened both the trafficking and the possession statutes to include more types of crimes. And they further broadened the forfeiture statutes that Nixon's administration had started with the RICO laws. And there's something that's not that subtle going on here. The war on crime is becoming a war on drugs. He's not only targeting traffickers and drug kingpins, as they're called, but he's going after the users, and he's making crime an issue for individual users the way it hadn't been in the past. So possession and use, rather than trafficking, are now an important target for law enforcement. If we go back and think about the steep increase in the number of people in prison over time, rising from 200,000 in 1970 to 1.7 million now, we see that after each election, there's kind of an inflection point as that curve goes up. So after the elections, it goes steeper and steeper and steeper through these presidential elections. It's a fairly dramatic view of what is going on as far as these laws and their effect on mass incarceration. Now, as I said before, George H.W. Bush got distracted from the war on drugs with his war on Iraq, and there was little major crime legislation during his administration. But Bill Clinton came in with the 1994 Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act. This is a huge piece of legislation. What this legislation does is there's the Violent Offender Incarceration and Truth in Sentencing Incentive Grants Program. What they're going to do is offer states grants if they will impose an 85% mandatory minimum prison sentence in their crime system. So if a state will say you have to have truth in sentencing, where for every sentence you spend 85% of that time in prison as a minimum without any negotiation with the judge, you will get grants for your police and for your prison construction. They also try using incentives to get 3 strikes laws in place, where if you get a third felony conviction, no matter how minor, you can get life in prison for the third strike. It allocated $8.8 billion for the hiring of new police by local police agencies. That's $8.8 billion for new police, and then $7.9 billion for prison construction. And if you look at a place like California, you'll see that I think they built 16 new prisons in an 8-year period in the 1980s. Now the important thing about this legislation is it's pushing federal legislation and the motivations behind the federal partisan dynamic down into the local states, and it's offering them money to do a variety of things, and then that money goes away and they have to keep those programs in place. So it ultimately winds up being a burden on local communities and states to finance the things that are being put in place by the 1994 Violent Crime Control Act. Now, I'm going to turn now to the third part and talk about the political economy of mass incarceration and the more fundamental forces behind it. So I've talked about the partisan dynamic, and then I moved down and talked about the legislation and the impact of legislation on mass incarceration. And now I'm going to get down below that and talk about the political economy of mass incarceration. Now, underlying the partisan dynamics I've discussed so far is a more fundamental and two-pronged convergence of general economic and political forces on one hand, and fundamental changes in on-the-ground popular dynamics around criminal justice reform on the other. So there's a political and economic convergence combined with some things going on in the popular movements for crime control. On the economic side, there are really 3 things that are going on here. The hallmark of the change in the economy is the turnaround and the recession of 1973 to 75. In the late 60s and early 70s, the rate of return on capital fell quite a lot, and this began the period of the ongoing war on labor and on the unions and federal fiscal policy. The federal fiscal policy of inflation was used to tame the unions, and for the first time in decades, unions were offering big concessions in their negotiations with the corporations. There was a deindustrialization that began in the late 60s and continued through the 70s and 80s. There's middle-class exodus that took hold in the cities, and jobs began to disappear overseas in a major way. And the expanse of what is termed the ghetto increased greatly. In the 1980s, for example, the Chicago neighborhoods that are classified as ghettos, that is having more than 40% of their population living below the poverty line, increased by 67%. So the second part of the political economy is the Keynesian project was being delegitimized in the popular mind, and ultimately signaled by the middle class revolt against taxes in the 70s and 80s. And third, we see the beginning of the dismantling of the welfare state in the early 70s with the Nixon administration, and the contest over the social contract starting in the Nixon administration and moving forward from there. So that's the political and economic side of what's going to happen in the 70s and 80s. And then on the other prong of the convergence was on the side of criminal justice reformers and what they are seeing and what they're trying to do. The important thing is that the delegitimization of the welfare state corresponded with a delegitimization of the reform and rehabilitation ideal in prison management. Over a number of years, the prisons in all states morphed into punitive warehouses and programs for rehabilitation fell away. At the same time, parole officers were increasingly deployed for surveillance and monitoring, and less so for assistance and reintegration. So by the 1980s, the prison system is a warehousing system. There is no incentive and no motivation behind incarcerating people to rehabilitate them and get them ready to return to the community. In addition to this punitive ethic, the criminal justice system came under attack in a more general way. The victim-perpetrator nexus was becoming a zero-sum game in the public eye, and any concession to the criminal, any leniency at all, was increasingly seen as a betrayal to the victim. Discretion and softness at any level bred distrust by the public. For example, legislatures were responding to what they saw as judicial softness by passing mandatory minimum laws and tying the hands of judges in the sentencing process. Ultimately, the outcome was that only the executive agents of the police and the prosecutors could be trusted to mete out justice in the public eye. They are the victim's protagonists and have increasingly been shielded from oversight by the courts and defense attorneys. Okay, so to see how this convergence played out on the ground, let's consider how the victims' rights and the women's rights movements evolved. In both Europe and the United States, victims' rights began to be an issue in the 1950s, and the movement strengthened throughout the 1960s. In Europe, there was a stronger welfare state than in the United States, and the movement focused on support and the recovery of victims. In the United States, with a weak social welfare state, we moved in a completely different direction, and the victims' rights movement became one of the forces on the punitive side of the transformation of criminal justice. They contributed to the fact that there was little support and lots of vitriol around incarceration and prosecutions. Now, similarly, the women's rights movement had an unfortunate consequence as well. The women's movements differed between Europe and the United States. In Europe, the women's movement had a broad base and was informed by Marxist and socialist ideologies. But in the United States, by contrast, the early women's movement was top-heavy, and some would call it elitist. And the early women's rights movement came to be co-opted by the punitive zero-sum side of the criminal justice reformers. Now, this was a completely different strategy to address the issues of rape and domestic violence than we saw in Europe, where support, recovery, and healing are the aim. In the United States, it became prosecution, punitiveness, and arrests. Now, despite the convergence where the politics and the economics are pushing on one side and the general popular movements are pushing on the other side and coming together to delegitimize both the welfare state and the criminal justice system, we see that, but corporate Keynesianism did not disappear. We're destroying the Keynesian ethic among the people, but corporate Keynesian remains strong. As we know in this room, the military-industrial complex was not challenged by any of this, and at the same time, the investment in the public sector was shifting. There were increasingly the bond issues and other investments in public goods, such as roads and education, is going down, but public investment in prisons is increasing dramatically in this time period. So as we're dismantling portions of the welfare state, the state's capacity isn't disappearing. It's being redeployed and transformed. So the last question to answer is, why did this become a war on crime and a war on drugs as we dismantle this, rather than something that might have been productive? There were alternatives in the 70s for a war on something, to put these resources to work in some other way. For example, Nixon was big on the cancer issue, and it was, if you look back, you could say, is there a possibility of putting all these resources to work in the war on cancer? And at the same time in the 70s, the ecology and sustainability movement was very big. It was probably more potent in the 70s than it is now, despite what's going on with our environment. And there was also a third alternative, which would be to continue to build the welfare state. But why were none of these alternatives taken up with this excess state capacity as we're dismantling the New Deal social compact? The reason none of these really took off is because a war on cancer would have led to an understanding that cancer is an environmental issue as much as an individual issue, and it would have resulted in regulation on the corporations and manufacturing. Same with ecological and sustainability movements. The result would have been regulation and pushback against the corporations and the manufacturing industries. So the war on drugs and the war on crime did none of those things, and in fact, to think about the war on crime and the war on drugs, it was an attempt, to quote Pete Beckett again, it was an attempt to reconstruct popular conceptions of the crime problem as a component of a much larger political contest, the effort to replace the social welfare state with social control as the principle of policy. Now, the curious paradox about this is that the neoliberal project, the dismantling of the state, did not affect the prison system early on in the 70s and the 80s. If we look at what Thatcher was doing in the 80s, she was pushing back against the criminal justice system and the prison system and cutting their budgets as well. And the United States, because of this convergence we had, we didn't do that. So the neoliberal project wasn't cutting back on the prison industrial complex. Instead, when the neoliberal project got involved in criminal justice, it was after the beast was growing and they saw there's a profit center here. So now that the prison industrial system is in place and growing, you start getting more and more and increased investment from the corporations. And now we see corporate-owned prisons, corporate use of imprisoned labor, and corporate services such as medical care provided to prisoners. Now, at the same time, as the corporate powers have been ensconced in the prison industrial complex, we see the prisons are becoming our primary source of rural redevelopment. The areas of the country that are losing jobs, losing farms, losing jobs that are on farms because consolidation farming are the strongest advocate, one of the strongest advocates of prison growth in the country. At the same time, we see that there's a kind of perverse incentive. As the Cold War ended, the Clinton administration had a major push to create dual-use technologies so that the military technologies that are created by DARPA and other agencies are being identified and modified for use by the police and by the prison industries. There were 16 agencies within DARPA that had a mandate to develop dual-use technology for policing and for prisons. Okay, now let me turn to my last and final section on what can we do. Now, the first step, I think, is public awareness and the building of a social movement to push back on the war on drugs. As I said at the beginning, the progressive community is becoming increasingly aware that this is a problem for the progressive left. And mass incarceration and the attack on the black community is an issue that we should all be concerned about and aware of. And this is a time to work on that public awareness outside of the progressive left and to bring other people around as well. As my quote from Eric Holder suggested, people are becoming aware of it and aware that it is a big problem. The other impetus behind public education is that people are seeing the prison systems of their states as a big cause of the budget problems their states are facing. Most states spend between 5 and 7% of their general revenues on their prison industries. So in Illinois, I believe it's 5.5% of our general revenues go to the prison industries. This doesn't include payments on bonds and things like that that were used to build prisons. It's the general revenue fund. The second thing we need to be doing on the left is we need to attack and dismantle the use of the prison system as a profit center for corporate America. We need to end the privatization of prisons and prison services, and we need to end the use of prisons as a domestic third world labor force. And finally, the most fundamental solution to the problem has to start really at the deep base. The ultimate solution requires not only pushing back against the police and the prisons, but we need a New Deal scale war on poverty and social inequality in the United States. Not only the inner cities, but rural America must be rebuilt. Prisons have become our rural redevelopment program, and that needs to end. We must at least begin to rebuild the welfare state and change the political environment from one of a zero-sum, we versus they, white versus everybody else mentality to one of a cooperative and sustainable political economy. Okay, now why don't I say thank you and open this up to questions, and we'll see what else I can fill in here.
Do we have more people in jail than all the other countries combined in the world, as I've read?
Not more than all the other countries combined, but we do have 25% of the prisoners. So we have 5% of the world's population and 25% of the prisoners. So the other countries, all combined, 168 or so other countries have 75% of the prisoners. But we far outstrip them in the number of prisoners per capita that we have.
And then how many other countries have private jails like we do?
That's a question I can't answer authoritatively. I do know that Britain has some private prisons. At the end of the Thatcher administration, their pushback against prisons changed because of some political dynamics shifted, and while Thatcher had been pushing back, later conservative administrations saw crime in prisons as a positive force in their agenda, and so the prisons began to grow, and there were some private prisons being built in Britain in the later 80s and early 90s. But I can't tell you authoritatively about the rest of the world in private prisons.
Just one moment. Can we use the microphone for questions? Because we're going to put this up on YouTube, so, this helps a whole lot on the audio side. So feel free just to come up here, use the microphone to comment, ask questions, whatever.
Regarding the privatization of prisons and so forth for minor incidents, will the legalization of marijuana for medical and recreational use move the United States in that direction, or is it just another opportunity for profit?
Well, I think part of the motivation for legalizing marijuana is profits. There's no doubt about that. And there are different ways states undertake to legalize marijuana. And if we look at Colorado, they have opened it it's wide open for corporate growing and selling, whereas some other states want a cooperative model for the growing of the marijuana. There's somebody here in the audience that can speak to that with far more authority than I can. But the legalization of marijuana and the decriminalization of marijuana is also a reaction to the prison issues and to the policing issues and the cost. So part of the motivation for legalizing marijuana, even for medical marijuana, is to push back against the problem that our policing patterns and our prison system has created. So marijuana is not unimportant. And also an important part about decriminalizing and legalizing marijuana is that one of the most damaging things we can do to the Mexican drug cartels is to grow our own. Yes.
I'd just like to bring up a flaw in the 13th Amendment. That this is obviously a joint partisan that it adds with each other because it made slavery illegal, except for where the states wanted to use slavery as a sentence for a crime. Right. So we had this condition where for years, as late as up to in the 1940s, where black people were arrested and sentenced to crime and then went to work at steel companies. They were used as slaves because now that was a legal aspect of slavery. So we have this thing from the very beginning, because we have this liberationist and conservative type of impetus going into laws, that you really don't get something that just says slavery is illegal, no exceptions.
Right. Well, yes. You're right that the 13th Amendment is flawed in that I think it's Article 2 says that no person shall be incarcerated except for reasons of crime or treason, I believe it says.
I can read. You want me to read it? Sure. Right here.
Yes, please.
Yeah.
We have somebody in the audience with
Why don't
me.
you take it up to the microphone?
Yes, I would. I didn't know. Okay. Yeah, the 13th Amendment says, Section 1, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction.
Right. But as Glenn was saying, the massive gaping hole in that law is the provision that except in the context of crime and being duly convicted. Prior to the Civil Rights Acts of the 1960s, Jim Crow was the racial context of American history of that time, and a lot of people don't realize, but in the early 60s, almost every black family could point to somebody in their extended family that had just disappeared. And people were arrested for vagrancy, for not having a job, for all kinds of minor crimes, and tossed into the county clink, where they were contracted out to work. And the steel industry in Birmingham was a prime culprit in this, where they have now dug up thousands of graves of paupers around where the steel forges were and where the coal mines were in Alabama in the 30s and 40s.
Yeah, I want to go back to this question about let's not leave it just at marijuana, but with the drug thing in general. I'm not quite certain if you made any mention of this. I mean, we had a lot of statistics, a lot of data that you were throwing out there, numbers, etc. But somewhere I recall reading or hearing that, like, you were talking about the number of people on any given night that are locked up somewhere in the United States, which I think is like unprecedented on the planet, perhaps except for, say, maybe China or something like that. But in any event, the numbers are just astronomical. But of that number, how does that break down in terms of just drug-related incarceration offenses? Now, and they're not just marijuana, but I know for a fact, like I was just last fall, I was over in the Netherlands. And you know, of course, the story over there with the so-called coffee houses. And I mean, for literally decades, they've had legalized not only marijuana, but hashish. And as far as like individuals that are using hard drugs, I mean, they're not, you know, they treat it more as a medical problem than they do as a criminal issue. And I'm kind of just dancing around with all this, but I wanted you to maybe speak to that in terms of like what those numbers are in the event that, like, if we had decriminalization of not just marijuana, legalizing marijuana even for just recreational use, but even narcotics, what that would mean in terms of like this topic we're talking about, you know, this prison industrial complex thing that we have here in this country, and what the ramifications would be if we could just like get, I mean, like my sense is it's half the population, prison population, if not more, that are in there for something that evolves around drugs in some fashion. But if you want to talk to that question.
Well, here in Illinois, 2/3 of the persons in prison are in prison for a nonviolent crime, and a great deal of those are drug crimes. So 2/3 are in prison for nonviolent crimes. One of the things that, in addition to increasingly criminalizing drug use and changing the laws on incarceration, the number of arrests hasn't increased that dramatically. What's happened is that if you are arrested, you're far, far more likely to go to prison than you were in the past. The mandatory minimums and the mandatory sentencing laws are a big part of what's driving the mass imprisonment issue. So people aren't using drugs more. We're actually using fewer drugs than we were 30 and 40 years ago, and fewer people are using those drugs. But if you are arrested, the probability of being in prison is far higher than it was, and the probability of being in prison for a long time is far higher than it was. So it's a policy. It's the policy impact that is driving that part of our mass incarceration problem.
Could you enumerate on what non-violent crimes are?
One of the things that just occurred to me as you were discussing this is that prisons in this country are primarily for, quote, supposed to be for legal reasons, but a lot of it seems to be for political reasons. I mean, the various laws that have been implemented, you know, imprison people for non-violent crimes, et cetera, et cetera. You know, one of the statistics, you know, that's not discussed at all, is you know, there are countries that have military prisons for quote, crimes against the state, as opposed to prisons for society for legal reasons, you know, for criminal reasons. And then thirdly, for incidental crimes. I mean, so this distinction in terms of how many people we have in prison needs to be unraveled to some degree. I mean, you know, the likes of Israel, for example, you know, I don't know, is the IDF holding X number of people in prison so that their social system has fewer people in prison?
Oh, I see what you're saying. So are there more, in Israel, are there more people in prison through the military courts than through the civilian courts, so that their numbers appear
you know, and
To
other,
be-
and other countries,
and other countries.
that may have such distinctions.
That's a very good question. I can't tell you about Israel at all, about that specific question. The question of whether are we putting people in prison for political purposes, in a sense, it depends on what you call political. I mean, we certainly, as we've deindustrialized and created these vast areas of our urban areas that are somewhat tumultuous and sources of pushback against the neoliberal project, we are putting people in prison that are potentially disruptive to the system. And as you look at where people are imprisoned, it is among the folks that have been dispossessed over the last 30 years economically. And the question is, are they a political threat, and is that why they're being imprisoned? There are folks that say they are a political threat and that's why they're being put in prison, and it is a political motive that puts them there. I don't know that it's that clear cut. I think the effect is to reduce the possibility of these folks acting, and I do know that in prison there is far less politicization than there used to be. There is far less education and far less radicalization going on in prisons. There is some, but I've not read anything on this, but I've talked to a lot of people because I'm very curious about what happened to the radicalizing impetus that prison was creating. And it appears, from the folks I've talked to, it appears that what happens is you don't politicize in prison, because as soon as you start teaching people and being a source of knowledge for other people and set yourself apart as a teacher in any way, they identify you as a gang member and put you in solitary. So it's extremely difficult to mobilize and organize in prison these days. So I can tell you pretty surely that people are in solitary confinement because of their political actions. I don't think mass incarceration is putting people in prison specifically because of a political action on their part, but it is does have the effect of reducing the pressure, the political pressure, and the pressure for social movement that we might have if we didn't have all these people in prison. Yes.
So, thank you very much. It was very informative. I was wondering if you could say a few words about mental health and how many people in the prisons are mental patients that did not get care in the community and that type of thing.
The largest providers of mental health care in the United States are the Cook County Jail and the Los Angeles County Jails. Some estimates are that 2/3 of the folks in Cook County Jail have a mental health issue that should be treated, and the amount of treatment that goes on there is actually quite huge, even though a lot of mental illness is overlooked. The magnitude of the mental health problems in prisons is hard to gauge, because it's hard to go in and do a comprehensive assessment. But there is no doubt that the mental health issues in prison are huge. And the one important consequence of that is that upon release, we have people that are seriously damaged and not well being released into the communities. And as a recognition of that, at least in Illinois now, they are trying to link folks that are being released from prison to some kind of care and to enroll them in Medicaid as they come out of prison, so that they can get some continuity of care for their mental health and other health issues. But how successful that's been at this point, I really don't know. the people that circulate through our jails that aren't actually sent to prison are, a huge proportion of them are mentally ill. And in a study I was involved in on the Cook County Juvenile Detention Center, we found that almost 2/3 of boys and over 2/3 of girls at intake into the Cook County Detention Center had a diagnosable mental illness coming into detention. So that's probably indicative of what's going on among adults as well. But that's 2 out of 3 of the children that we're putting into the Cook County Juvenile Detention Center have a diagnosable mental illness. And that was a very well done study. It's one of the best ever done, and it's widely cited, and has had a big impact. And so those are pretty solid numbers.
I just want to mention that Sheriff Tom Dart just made a statement about how the jail populations are very high because of the people there. That's only where they can get mental health treatment at all. If they get it, no matter what the quality of that people are. That happened during the 80s when Reagan budgets defunded a lot of the mental health care. And so you had a lot more people that would not be in jail, but they are there because of their acting out in other ways. And
Right.
fortunately, if they can get arrested rather than tased to death, they're fortunate. What I wanted to talk about in relation to political prisons, we see news stories of Middle Eastern countries where someone insults the emir of some state and is sentenced to jail. Well, we don't do that. We find that abhorrent in this country. What we do is we overclassify information that should be, it has no other reason for being classified except that the information would be embarrassing to those holding office. And so when this information is leaked, we are now having large numbers of prosecutions for leaking classified information. So the net effect is that we embarrass someone, we have a different language and a different thought process, but we are still imprisoning people for embarrassing our so-called elected leaders. The same thing that happens in the Middle East countries, the same thing that an emir does. And I just want to toss that out.
Well, it is true that the Obama administration is prosecuting more people than have ever been prosecuted for leaking information. And I think you're right that we do overclassify, and I think that's pretty clear, and that it is embarrassing when that stuff comes out. The magnitude of those prosecutions, though, is not to minimize it at all, because it does have a quashing impact on all kinds of activity, but compared to what happens in the inner city communities of Chicago, it's fairly small numbers of people that are being prosecuted, and even smaller number that are actually going to prison. But yeah, we are moving down that path.
Years ago, I read this book, The Great Depression of 1990. It was written by an Indian economist that was teaching at some of the universities in the United States. This guy came to fame because about 5 years before the fall of the Shah of Iran, he predicted the month, the year, and also the date that he will fall. And he did. And so people are saying, how did you know? And his answer said, well, I didn't know when he was falling, but I look at the numbers. And the numbers were that he was, when he was studying economics in India, one of his professors said, study falling cities, states, and different things, and you will notice that it's something in common. And what was in common was that these societies have come to the point where a small amount of people in that society earn most of the money or possess most of the wealth. And he said when these two curves combined, he put the date, and that was it. And he was studying the Iran economics, and so he came to that conclusion. So he published the book, and it happened to coincide. My question is, if you could read the book and see when that combination of lines happened and how far are we from falling in the same black hole, where the amount of people who have so much money, and what he explained it in economic terms, is they couldn't be efficient and invest in that money, so it's wasted. You start falling the infrastructure, education, and all that start falling because it's too much money in a very few hands. So that was my.
Well, I can't predict when the United States is going to fall because of the inequality. But as long as you brought up the issue, let me talk about inequality and the prison industrial complex. And we do know that more, if you look at the OECD countries, the rich countries in the world, that among more unequal rich countries, there are higher rates of imprisonment. There are higher rates of prosecutions, higher rates of imprisonment. There are also higher rates of conflict among children, higher rates of mental health issues. So the more inequality you have several things that might be driving your jailing and prison dynamics. Children have more conflict, there's more homicide, there's more violent crime, the more unequal the society is. And in addition to that, the more unequal a society is, the more punitive are their criminal laws, and the more punitive are their prison conditions. So we have both of those things that, on the one hand, you're driving people into situations where they're likely to be imprisoned, and you're making the prisons harsher and more difficult to come out of and be successful again, have a successful life afterwards. So the inequality card is a very important card to consider when you're looking at imprisonment.
Yeah, you know, I'd like to go back to, maybe you can expand on this. You were talking before, when you were doing your general presentation. What do we know about privatization? I mean, and so, well, let's drill down a little more into the detail on, if we can, on the political economy side of this question. Like, well, what about cost and profitability? How much money are they? I'm talking about these, these corporations that are like making, I guess, literally hundreds of millions of dollars. Not that if it's state-owned or something that necessarily makes it any better, but I'm just curious about where this is going, what this means in terms of what's actually happening out there on the ground. I mean, what is the cost to incarcerate a human being for, say, that was what I was asking you the question from the floor earlier. I was unclear as to when you were talking about that, what you meant by those numbers. But that would be interesting to know. I mean, if you could possibly make some comparisons here between what we know about, like, what it costs the state to house an individual for, say, a year versus how much money is XYZ, prison industries making off of that same privatized prisoner, if you could, address that question.
Okay. In Illinois, the cost of imprisoning a person varies a great deal between facilities. It costs about $23,000 at a minimum security prison to keep one person in prison for 1 year in Illinois. It goes up to around $65,000 a year to keep a person in solitary confinement for the year. So I think the average in Illinois is somewhere around $35,000 or $40,000 per prisoner per year, which is approximately what you would pay to go to Harvard before they started waiving tuition for all their undergraduates. So the cost is pretty enormous, and when you multiply that by 1.7 million, I believe everybody in this room is paying about $450 a year in taxes for for imprisoning people. We're not talking about the criminal justice system in general, but for imprisoning people. So that's the individual burden. So if you have a family of 3, you're paying over $1,000 a year in taxes to maintain the prison system.
Do you know what those private industries are?
No, privatization is I mean, there's an odd dynamic in privatization. I mean, some states don't allow privatization of prisons. In Illinois, for example, the Illinois state constitution does not allow us to build private prisons and to do that. Instead, what we do is we have privatized medical care in prisons, and there's some controversy about a $10 billion contract that's going to a corporation to provide medical care in Illinois prisons over the next 5 to 10 years. That's a huge amount of money, and medical care is a huge cost to prisons. So privatizing services is one of the issues we need to consider in addition to privatizing prisons. Federal prisons are being privatized in probably the greatest number of private prisons are federal prisons at this point. I'm not absolutely sure about that. But in states that do privatize their prisons, there's 2 forms of pushback. There's they have a popular problem in that privatization leads to less well-trained, less well-paid guards, and in Ohio, the Corrections Corporation of America had a big problem because people kept breaking out of their prison, and it gave them a very bad name. And so there was pushback in the legislature to privatizing prisons in Ohio. And the other pushback is from the unions that represent the prison guards. In California, one of the largest lobbyist organizations is the prison guards union. It's a very large and very powerful lobby. And so anytime privatization comes up in state legislatures, the guards unions are right there to push back. I believe at this point about 5% of prisons in the United States are privately run, which is not huge, but it's an important issue. As far as private corporations using prison labor, there's also a funny dynamic there in that you run up against, if you're going to be doing manufacturing in prison, you run up immediately against the issues of safety versus efficiency. And manufacturing in prisons is very difficult because guards want to inspect every piece of material that comes in, inspect everything, keep close control over what's happening, and then inspect everything that's going out. So it creates some inefficiencies in the manufacturing process. So prisons that are successfully providing labor are often providing service types of labor, phone banking, phone centers, and things of that sort, where you're not moving material through the prison. And the other problem with prison labor is the quality, the workforce pushback on the shop floor tends to be a little more dramatic, and you get less quality product. The Air Force, for example, has federal prisoners building wiring harnesses for their jets, and they have discovered that they have at least twice the failure rate as do those that are produced in a private facility somewhere else that's not in a prison. So there are a number of issues to consider about privatization, and it seems to me a long way off that prisons are going to be able to pay their own freight. It's an issue that has a lot of clout right now, but it's not the biggest issue we need to be concerned about. We need to be concerned about privatization and building private prisons, but we need to be concerned about building prisons, period. There are more prisons being built that aren't private prisons than that are private prisons. We do need to push back against the Corrections Corporation of America and the way it's trying, it's very successful at lobbying to build prisons and to provide services to prisons. We should be pushing back against that, it's a good thing to push back against that, and it's to our benefit. But it's not the biggest thing that's going on in the prison industrial complex. I mean, the numbers just aren't as big as the issue seems to be.
Ancillary to your implied indictment of the government corporation manipulation to produce laws which incarcerate people and so forth. I was wondering why the judicial and legislative emphasis today is on concealed carry. Why do they want to have us carry guns?
Well, I think my take. I mean, I'm not going to claim a lot of expertise on the issue of why do they want us to carry guns, but it seems to me that the impetus behind that, the reason people are it's such a volatile issue and such a heart-wrenching issue for so many people, is because, as I mentioned, the carceral state is in a sense delegitimized. The police, anywhere in from the policing to the prosecution to the judging to the incarceration, where there's discretion, it's become delegitimized. So the laws that are passing are more and more draconian and give the people along the way less and less leeway to make decisions. So mandatory minimums are there because people don't trust that judges will make decisions that are harsh enough. And it's in part because it's delegitimized. Our systems, our government systems in general are delegitimized and people don't trust them. And I think the gun issue is people don't trust local institutions to protect them, and they feel that they need those guns to protect themselves. Now, the funny thing about gun laws is that the people that are least likely to be victimized, rural white people, are the strongest supporters of gun laws. The survey information on that shows that they are aware that they are least likely. I mean, they don't feel at risk personally, and they don't. But they're still very strong advocates of freedom to carry and concealed carry. So the issue is a little muddy, but I think the fact that people don't trust institutions, public institutions, to protect them is a big part of it. And I think the pushback against the social welfare state has a general impact of delegitimizing all government and all institutions. And that's part of it.
I recently finished reading Masha Gessen's account of Pussy Riot and their incarceration, and it's a very interesting book. But two of the women were incarcerated in prisons, and they were taken all the way outside of Moscow, many miles, and it took, I don't know, 4 hours to drive there or something. But what happened is that they were really forced into sewing clothing for 12 or 16 hours a day, that then the prison sold back to whoever it is that bought them, and the prisoners got $1 a month or something, and the prison officials then put the rest in their pocket. And I'm just wondering how much actual exploitation of prison labor, and both in private and public prisons, goes on in terms of using prisoners and charging a lot for their labor, and then they get paid a little bit, but it's not anywhere.
As I mentioned before, publicly it sounds really good to make prisoners pay their own freight, and the laws have been changed since the 80s to allow more of that, and There were laws in place that kept corporations from coming in and using labor in prisons for private purposes. Those were being changed by the 80s as federal laws. I can't recall the specifics offhand, but the magnitude of corporately run labor in prisons is fairly minimal. Because it's really hard. It's hard to organize inside a prison the kinds of discipline you need to run an assembly line or something like that. It's, outside of prison, we now have a labor force that has been pretty well disciplined by the austerity of the past 40 years. And it's in a lot of ways cheaper to use the labor that we have outside of the prison or to go overseas, and you have far less burden. Christian Parente argues that the corporations that are making a profit in prisons are doing so because either the state or the federal government is giving them an advantage. So, for example, the furniture manufacturer, company's name is Unicore, I believe, that builds office furniture in the federal prisons, has a locked-in market to sell all that furniture to federal agencies. So they probably couldn't make a profit if they had to sell that on the open market because of all the inefficiencies of doing it in prison. And Christian Parente makes a pretty strong argument about that. And it's to the extent that you don't see it happening more is somewhat convincing to me, because there are huge numbers of prisoners that aren't working, and if it were that profitable, you would expect to see a lot more of it, I would think.
I just want to comment on the issue of guns in the black community. I read a book. The name of it is Negroes and the Gun. It's an academic press, and it describes the black tradition of having guns. Black people living out in rural areas not being protected. The concern that many KKK organizations actually met in the police departments. You would make a call to police, you would never know what uniform would appear at your door, whether it would be the white hood or the police officer's uniform. In the book, it put cases where people defended themselves against KKK and actually shot a couple of the people in robes. It turned out they were actually police officers, but they were able to actually win in court and say that they were defending themselves. So it was a one rare case where police officers were being shot and by a black person, and they were found to be not guilty. So there's a lot of different reasons. Martin Luther King was frequently in houses that had many guns in them. Martin Luther King himself applied for a concealed carry weapon because he knew that there were people that were not going to protect him in any other way. He finally opted out later in his life to say he didn't want to really have that because that was not going to be the solution of the problem. It was a very good book, and it tells a different story, and it does mention the much higher rate of black on black crime versus use of guns than there in a white community. So it was a very good thing. And that's been, according to this book, it's been going on for many years, not just now, because black people are afraid to call police department for very many different reasons, which means that their only means of when they're involved in an unequal exchange of goods or services, they have no recourse to courts, they have no recourse to police department, they have to solve the issue themselves. In communities where people can actually go to court and bring certain issues up, there's less likelihood that they're going to go to a gun. They're going to go on the record and go before a judge, and depending on what the outcome is, they're not going to wind up shooting at each other. So I think it's a failure of this society to actually treat people that are in these communities and forcing them to rely on their own resource to protect themselves. And as a consequence, more people are being killed because of that.
Well, I think you're right, and one reaction to that has been to create community-engaged policing, to have the police working within the community to solve problems proactively. And the idea is a great idea, but it's kind of like, oh, I'm going to send the military in to keep peace. It doesn't always work, and it's really hard to train a police officer to be a community problem solver when what you've trained that officer for is and what that officer gets as incentives is arrests and convictions. The officers aren't rewarded for, well, I prevented a conflict over here, or I intervened over here, or I got this landlord to fix this problem. That's not what they get points for on the job. They get points for arresting 16 people in a day or whatever they're doing. So while the community engaged policing has a very mixed record, I think the fact that what it generally does, consistently does, is to create more surveillance by the police more deeply into the community to identify things that are problems or issues that are arrestable.
I'll try to make it as brief as I can. This issue with guns, there was a documentary made from one of Martin Luther King's lieutenants or someone who lived during that same time frame called Blacks with Guns, and that details a lot of this, that blacks needed to have guns in order to keep the police from running roughshod over the community. Okay, having said that, when I mentioned earlier political prisoners, I didn't mean prisoners because of political views, but politically inspired prisoners. Those who are in prison because of, you mentioned Clinton's Minimum Sentencing Act, or 3 strikes are out. These people are in prison because of politically, by laws that were instituted. They shouldn't be in prison. I mean, a woman whose boyfriend is selling drugs, for example, why should she be imprisoned for minimums under the Minimum Sentencing Act? Arizona, for example, they're profiling of certain part of the population to imprisoned. I mean, that's political, And these prisons were built by companies who contributed to her re-election. I mean, these are all political consequences of a growing prison population.
Right. No, I absolutely agree with you. Let me back up and talk about, I mean, if you look at the political economy and the creation of a disposable class of people from the late 60s forward to the legislation that results in a lot of those folks being in prison, and then on top of that are the partisan political dynamics that result in the specific laws and the specific way that we criminalize those classes of people and put them in prison. There are certainly political solutions to the problem that could, that have a number of potential ways to play out in the specifics. So if I understand your question, it is, what are the political dynamics that lead to this mass incarceration?
What is the percentage of the population in prison because of these acts?
And what is the percentage of people that are in prison because of these political questions that have been answered in a specific way for specific kinds of criminalization?
Yeah, because you're Mexican, you look Mexican, and you're, you know, you're
Well,
in prison. Profiling.
Well, you know, I'm not sure I understand your question, but let me answer it this way. I mean, all laws are political, and criminal laws have been highly politicized, and so at one level you could argue that everybody that's in prison is there because of a political decision along the way by somebody. I think the political dynamic since the early 70s that has resulted in the mass incarceration that sets America apart from the rest of the world would suggest that the difference between 1.7 million and 200,000, all those people are in there for political reasons, because of a political decision that was made in the past 40 years. I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but I think that's on point. I'm not positive.
The increased number of people who are in prison because of this.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, the war on crime and the war on drugs is, at its apex, driven by, it has been driven by partisan political dynamics. So it is a political issue in that sense. And that gives us one point where to push back is at the political level, we can push back against some of these things. But we need to push back in other places as well. And ultimately, we need to really reform the way our communities are built and the resources that are available to our communities, because that's what's going to really resolve a lot of the problems that then become criminalized. So we need to push back on the criminalization, and we need to push forward on making our communities robust and capable of policing themselves the way the way a lot of our suburban communities do.
That's going to be the final comment then. Thank you very much.